Hey guys, it's Cyrus of Chaos. Today I'm here with my friend Elijah Granet. He and I have known each other for at least 10 years or something at this point. We used to be teammates at New York Athletic Club, and he went to Columbia University and then Cambridge University for law school. So today we're going to be discussing the letter that Sweden sent to a bunch of people protesting the appointment of Alisher Usmanov as a presidential candidate of the FIE. So I'm going to let Elijah introduce himself, and then we're going to read the letter and discuss its legal implications. So Elijah, take it away.
Hi, I'm Elijah. I fenced saber at both Columbia and Cambridge, and then after Cambridge went to do law school in the UK, and so I now have fencing academic championship titles and law degrees in 2 countries, and so I'm hoping to put those together as we enter the unusual world of fencing law.
I'm sure there's not a whole lot of people who specialize in that field, but yeah. So upon reading the letter, I mean, we're gonna go through it pretty thoroughly, but just reading the letter, what are your first impressions of what you saw?
I think Sweden has a very strong argument here. I think we can also, in the tone of the letter, see the frustration of the Swedish Federation with the FIE, and that's been going on for a couple of years now with a lot of critique from their head, Otto Drakenberg, and I think that things have finally come to a head, and Sweden is going to just pull out everything to try to get the FIE back on track.
All right, so on that note, we're going to share screen, and we'll start talking about this. All right, so first, can you see the screen?
Yep.
All right, fantastic. So I was sent this as a PDF because it was sent out by the Swedish Federation to many people, and I actually had several people send this to me, and I, of course, sent it to several more people, and so we're just going to discuss what the letter says. So it's titled, Objection Against Mr. Alisher Usmanov as Candidate for the Presidency of the FIE. On October 28th, the FIE Bureau presented the list of candidates for upcoming elections to be held at the FIE Congress in Tashkent, Uzbekistan on November 30th. Mr. Alisher Usmanov is candidate for the presidency of the FIE. According to the statute's Article 4.14, each national federation can contest the list of candidates communicated by the Bureau. A contestation shall be tried by Executive Committee after advice from the Legal Commission and the persons concerned.
So I think here it's very important to note that the statutes deal with the Executive Committee deciding this, and that's very important because there are bodies within the FIE, namely the Ethics Committee, and also, in addition to the Legal Commission, the Disciplinary Committee, that are required by the statutes to be made up of people who are in their home country, a lawyer, a judge, an arbitrator, something with qualifications. That is not the case of the Executive Committee. The Executive Committee are the people who run the FIE, and they get there through the usual politics and getting approved by enough member states and working the Congress and getting voted in. And so it's a very interesting situation where this is a trial of the contestation, but ultimately the decision is with the people who run the FIE and not the neutral bodies within it.
Gotcha. The Swedish Fencing Federation hereby contests and objects to Mr. Alisher Usmanov's candidature as president for the FIE. The Swedish Fencing Federation requests that the Executive Committee rejects Mr. Alisher Usmanov's candidature and removes Mr. Alisher Usmanov's name from the list of candidates. The FIE is a non-profit organization which is subject to laws and regulations of the Swiss Confederation, Switzerland. Accordingly, the FIE must comply with laws and regulations in force in Switzerland. According to the FIE Statutes Article 5.1, the management of the FIE is entrusted to the Executive Committee in between Congresses. Accordingly, when the Congress is not in session, it is the Executive Committee's duty and responsibility to make sure that the FIE complies with laws and regulations in force in Switzerland. On March 4th, 2022, Mr. Alisher Usmanov was sanctioned by Switzerland. The Swiss authorities justified the sanctions against Mr. Usmanov by pointing out that Mr. Usmanov, 1. actively supported material or financially and benefited from Russian decision makers responsible for the annexation of Crimea and the destabilization of Ukraine. 2. is a leading business person operating in Russia and a business person involved in an economic sector providing a substantial source of revenue to the government of the Russian Federation, which is responsible for the annexation of Crimea and destabilization of Ukraine. And thirdly, is actively supporting the Russian government's policies of destabilization of Ukraine.
And so there we have basically the case against Usmanov, who has been sanctioned pretty much around the world and who is, like almost everyone, rich in Russia, very close to the government because they let him be rich. And so these are things that have been known for a while and really came to a head in the past couple of years.
Yeah, for sure. The Swedish Federation has asked the Sanctions Division of the Federal Department of Economic Affairs in Switzerland about the legal implications of Swiss sanctions, and the Sanctions Division states that a sanctioned person is not eligible for a position in the FIE if such an election would entail the reception of economic resources. According to the FIE Administrative Rules Article 7.2.5, Alisher Usmanov will be granted an allowance equivalent to €100 per day when the Executive Committee have meetings. Furthermore, Mr. Alisher Usmanov will receive compensation for travel expenses and accommodations in connections with Executive Committee meetings. Based on the mentioned FIE rules, Mr. Usmanov is not eligible to any position in the FIE because the election of Mr. Usmanov will entail that he will receive economic resources which make him not eligible according to Swiss law.
Now that, I think, is a very interesting point, because if I were a pro-Usmanov person in the FIE, the thing I would immediately do would be to say the president is no longer entitled to €100 per day or travel expenses, which won't bother a billionaire like Mr. Usmanov, and suddenly he's not paid. And I think that is something that may very well happen, because it's just the administrative rules, they're changeable, and it is a very interesting point that he's allowed to be the president as long as no one gives him money, which is a very odd thing.
Yeah, that is odd. Seems like a very obvious loophole as well. So, the Sanctions Division also explains that it is the responsibility of individuals, companies, and organizations to ensure compliance with the measures in place. As mentioned above, the FIE must comply with laws and regulations in force in Switzerland, including the sanctions issued by Switzerland. Furthermore, it is the Executive Committee's duty and responsibility to make sure that the FIE comply with these laws, regulations, and sanctions. Accordingly, there is no other alternative for the Executive Committee than to reject Mr. Alisher Usmanov's candidature. If the Executive Committee approves Mr. Alisher Usmanov's candidature, this will imply legal consequences for the FIE and the individual members of the Executive Committee, which we're going to just call COMEX for brevity for the rest of this article. The individual members of COMEX may also have to face legal consequences in their home countries should they be citizens of countries having imposed sanctions against Mr. Usmanov.
And that the consequences could be very serious. So I was taking a look before this recording at the Swiss Civil Code, and in the provisions governing these voluntary associations, these Vereins, they're often referred to because they're known by that German term, there aren't many laws, but among them is that if the association isn't complying, it could be anything up until dissolution, that a court could say the FIE won't exist. Now, that won't happen, but I think it's a very important thing for the Swedish Federation to be able to wave and go, you are potentially threatening the existence of the entire FIE, and for people concerned with compliance, that is lawyers, the fact that that won't actually happen does not change how scary that is, even as a theoretical
possibility.
Outcome.
Yeah,
so
for sure.
This is a really powerful point.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that is a little scary. So, this is my favorite part of this. Mr. Usmanov is sanctioned by the following 38 countries: Australia, Austria, Belgium, Bulgaria, Canada, Croatia, Cyprus, Czechia, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, France, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Iceland, Ireland, Italy, Japan, Latvia, Liechtenstein, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Malta, Netherlands, New Zealand, spelled wrong, Norway, Poland, Portugal, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, South Korea, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, United Kingdom, and United States. Many of those countries... Yeah, it could be. Many of those countries, by the way, are on the list of places that have pledged support for him. Mr. Usmanov is thus currently subject to sanctions in roughly a quarter of the countries that have national fencing federations. Of the 38 listed above, there is no fencing federation in Liechtenstein.
I think what you brought up, by the way, is a very important point, which is the governments of these countries and the European Union as well, are the people imposing these sanctions. But fencing federations, although they have legal personality in those countries, in the way that, for example, USA Fencing is incorporated in the United States and exists, but they are independent of the government. And so what the fencers in those countries, or rather the people who manage the fencing federations, want may actually be completely opposite of what their governments want, which in most cases is that Alisher Usmanov gets nothing nice and is generally has a bad time of things.
And does that still apply if, hypothetically, the Fencing Federation is getting money through the sports ministry of the government?
That can always be conditioned depending on the country. And, of course, in some countries, there isn't the separation. I think the United States is obviously an outlier here, the sort of complete separation, and they may be close, and there may be sort of different national rules. But I also suspect that most sports ministries, even in countries that like fencing, pay that much attention to this.
Yeah, I would assume not. The implication of the sanctions imposed on Mr. Usmanov is not only that the FIE and the individual members of COMEX would be breaking Swiss law and the law of many other countries should the Executive Committee decide that Mr. Usmanov is eligible as candidate for the presidency of the FIE. With Mr. Usmanov as president, the FIE would have a president who, among other things, would be prevented from visiting the FIE headquarters in Lausanne, prevented from visiting 37 of the member federations, most likely more because of travel bans, preventing the FIE from accessing its funds, which is a really big deal, and preventing the FIE from functioning efficiently, which obviously also is a big problem.
Yeah, and I think it becomes this chain reaction because the FIE is potentially not in compliance with sanctions. Suddenly, banks don't want to touch it because, especially because of the reach of the United States and the international banking sector, anything that even smells of non-compliance with sanctions, suddenly the FIE can't move money around. Suddenly, other companies and countries don't want to deal with it. So that is, I think, the biggest fear here is that having Usmanov re-elected president does risk that suddenly all the various banks and airlines and everything else that has to deal with a functioning fencing federation go, you're not worth risking our entire business for, even if you run fencing.
Yeah, totally. That's actually a point I wanted to bring up at the end when we were done talking about this, but while we're on the subject, what if we were able to attract the attention of someone like Red Bull, who several of our athletes represent, and who ultimately would be a really, really big draw to the sport if we had someone like that paying attention to us? If suddenly we had a president who was sanctioned by 37 countries, then I would have to think that those people would think twice about wanting to deal with us.
Yeah, and I think it would go especially to a lot of the things that the FIE says it believes in and says it works for, where they partner with humanitarian organizations, where they try to help developed countries, where they say they're standing up for human rights. And that's one of the reasons companies want to partner with it, or companies want to deal with it, because it does good things. It promotes sport and peace and love, but that's very hard to maintain with a straight face if the person running it is also leading the war in Ukraine. And I think that is the most effective method, is getting to companies, getting to money, especially because right now Usmanov can't donate to the FIE. So his checkbook can't make up for losing other things. So I think people who are worried or upset about this should be looking at sponsors, should be looking at things like this to put pressure on it. And I think generally with all the various companies that are affiliated with the Olympics and the Olympic movement, and have also almost all withdrawn from Russia, asking them if they're comfortable with this. And I think that's a very powerful tool.
Yeah, I didn't even think about the fact that many of those countries have already withdrawn from Russia. Any of those, companies have already withdrawn from Russia. And I would think that any company that's already withdrawn from Russia would think twice about working with an organization that is being presidented by a sanctioned Russian oligarch. That's just my opinion.
And especially where the FIE gives out awards, they make people a member of honor, and in theory, he's the one who's supposed to hand them out, the president. Yeah. So it would be very hard to sponsor the FIE awards or sponsor the championships if, in theory, if they take place in Tashkent or wherever, he's the one who's going out there and giving it out. Well, suddenly if you're Red Bull publicity, you can't put that out. You can't
of course not.
Deal with it.
Yeah.
And so it just becomes a huge financial block to a sport that already is always in financial troubles.
Yeah, not a good look for us. It is, of course, a fundamental requirement that the president of the FIE can visit all the member federations and that he is able to help the FIE manage its affairs. The leader of world fencing cannot be persona non grata in significant parts of the world or prohibited from taking any part in the membership and management and leadership of the organization. The president of the FIE should promote the interests of fencing everywhere in the world while clearly and openly taking responsibility for every decision made by the organization. I think
this is an argument about voting, but it's not really a legal argument. It's an argument about why he would be a terrible president and, in effect, has been unable to do anything for the past 2 years. But I'm not sure there's actually anything in the statutes that says the person elected president has to be. The qualifications for president in the FIE statute so that you have to be 25. Oddly, to be on the executive committee, you have to be 21, but I guess they want you 4 years older and able to rent a car or something. I really don't know how they got that. A member of a national fencing federation, that you have full civic rights in your country, so I guess you have to be able to vote and get elected. So I'm not totally sure this is a legal argument, even if it's a very strong argument about why it would be a bad thing to elect him president.
Yeah, if there was a meeting in, I don't know, one of the countries, we'll say South Korea because that was listed above there, he would not be able to attend that event. And would we have to move it to another country that he's able to go to? Bulgaria is on the list of countries that sanctions him, and I literally think like a fifth of our tournaments are held in Plovdiv. So that would be pretty prohibitive just by itself.
Right, and I think as they allude to earlier in the letter, at some point if you can't take a connecting flight in Paris or Berlin or London or New York, the amount of places you can go in the world is just limited, because if suddenly there's a huge swathe of the map where you can't even change planes, it's very hard to go only by direct flights from Moscow.
I hadn't considered that either. Mr. Alisher Usmanov cannot fulfill any of these responsibilities, these requirements, and the executive committee must therefore stand up to its duty and responsibility and reject Mr. Usmanov's candidature. Mr. Alisher Usmanov himself seems to understand that he cannot act as president of the FIE because of the sanctions imposed on him. On March 1st in 2022, Mr. Usmanov self-suspended as president of the FIE because of the sanctions issued against him on February 28th of that same year by the European Union. He could not travel to FIE headquarters in Lausanne and to member federations, and the assets of the FIE were placed under sanction because of the sanctions issued against him. Self-suspension does not exist as a legal concept in the statutes of the FIE. Therefore, the only possible interpretation of Mr. Usmanov's self-suspension is that he resigned as president on the 1st of March.
I think that is actually a very strong argument, because that's absolutely true. There is nothing in the FIE statutes about the president essentially having 25th Amendment powers, as in the U.S., to declare that he's going in and unfit for a certain period of time. I think it has to be that he resigned. And actually, if you look at the press, for example, from Inside the Games, a lot of people just interpreted that and reported it as he resigned and didn't even bother with his twists of language, but that raises a lot more questions of, shouldn't the FIE have been correctly saying who is president for the past 2 years?
And if he resigned as president, is there something in there saying that he's not allowed to run again, or that there's a period of time before he's allowed to run again?
No, because he hasn't been sanctioned by the FIE, even though he's been sanctioned by so many countries. I don't see any reason he wouldn't be able to run again. I think the only argument is the one Sweden made a little earlier, which is if he resigned because there's something in his situation that makes him unable to be president of the FIE, then arguably someone who is unable to discharge the office of president shouldn't be allowed to run for president.
Right, because those circumstances that led to his self-suspension have not changed in any way.
If anything, they've gotten worse.
Right.
Switzerland has imposed more sanctions in the meantime.
Yeah. And I have a hard time seeing how someone who suspended themselves already would be able to come back and run the organization efficiently now when there are more sanctions on him than there were when he decided to self-suspend in the first place.
Right, and it raises questions about why he's running, and it must be some degree of ego, and he thinks that because the FIE is willing to put him on letterhead or something, or invite him to tournaments he's allowed to go to, he likes being president, I guess. But the fact that he recognizes that in the day-to-day he can't act as president means it's even if he gets his way and is elected, it's really pointless.
If Mr. Usmanov's candidature is allowed, the Congress should elect Mr. Usmanov as president for another term. Mr. Usmanov must, again, because of the sanctions imposed upon him, immediately suspend himself, that is, immediately resign as president of the FIE, basically what we just talked about. The Executive Committee must, of course, reject a candidature for the presidency of the FIE if it is clear to the Executive Committee already before the election that the candidate will resign as soon as he's elected president.
That bit I don't think is true. It's not really in the statutes. It's common sense. But I think this must, of course, is a bit of lawyer bravado to try to get the Executive Committee to do this. But I don't actually think there's a reason that someone can't run for president and then immediately resign, other than, again, common sense, and it's pointless.
Yeah, exactly. Finally, the Swedish Fencing Federation was surprised to read that the Bureau, when presenting the list of presidential candidates for the upcoming election, not only indicated the member federations presenting the candidature of Mr. Alisher Usmanov, but also included information about which member federations that had supported Mr. Usmanov's candidature. This action by the Bureau raises questions. What legal support does the Bureau have to include member federations that support a candidate when presenting the candidate? How does the Bureau define the concept of support, and through which process is the accuracy of the support assured? Could the FIE provide the Swedish Fencing Federation with written documentation of this support from every federation? If yes, please do. Which fencing federation presented Alisher Usmanov as a candidate? Please provide supporting documents. Mr. Otto Drakenberg is presented as a candidate by the Swedish Fencing Federation. However, there are other member federations around the world supporting Mr. Otto Drakenberg's candidature. Why did the FIE not ask Mr. Otto Drakenberg if there were any member federations supporting the candidature before the list of candidates was presented?
I think this is all their really strongest point, because there's no justification. The FIE statutes discuss presenting the candidates, which, if you think about it, makes sense that someone who wants to be president has to be nominated by one of the member federations, because the member federations are the members of the association that is the FIE. But this idea of support, well, that's just the equivalent of going on a candidate poster endorsed by the local sheriff's association and the local women's club. Well, that's campaigning. And the fact that they only do this for one candidate, the fact that it's not clear what support means. Does that mean that each fencing federation passed a resolution? Did they hold meetings, and is it on the record? Or did merely someone on their board support it? And the fact that they didn't give this opportunity to every candidate is really inexcusable.
Biased.
And is a clear sign that they are putting the weight behind it. Unfortunately, that also may be the sign why the executive committee may not be so friendly to these strong points, if this is evidence, as it seems to be, that there is institutional support for one candidate, which obviously shouldn't happen, but apparently is.
Mm-hmm. The Swedish Fencing Federation requests that the FIE distributes a list of member federations supporting the candidature of Mr. Otto Drakenberg, which, as we already mentioned, they did for Usmanov already. The Swedish Fencing Federation will send such a list to the FIE in order to secure that the integrity of the elections cannot be questioned on the ground that the candidates have been treated differently. Furthermore, the Swedish Fencing Federation requires that the FIE put into place a mechanism that ensures the member federations to change which candidate they are supporting. It is most desirable that the integrity of the Congress as the supreme decision maker of the FIE should not be sidestepped by an abnormal, non-statutory procedure that gives the impression that the election process of no value, since the COMEX has already stated as a fact that a majority of the member federations are already supporting one of the candidates.
I think that's, again, just a strong point. It's only when the FIE Congress meets and votes on this matter that anything actually happens. And so implying that no one should run or that the game is over is essentially a way of discouraging candidates, which is really misleading when nothing has happened until the Congress has met and the votes are actually taken. And so, again, it's a very strong point, but it also reveals the weakness because they are asking the executive committee to clarify about the bad thing the executive committee already did.
The elections are to be held on November 30th, 2024. This matter is therefore urgent, and the Swedish Fencing Federation expects the Executive Committee to answer the questions above and to communicate the decision to reject Mr. Usmanov's candidature on Friday, the 8th of November at the latest, which, as of the recording of this video, is 3 days from now.
Yes, so this is lawyer speak, and by expects, what they actually mean is, of course you're not going to do this, but it's a way of, we have given you an opportunity to change it, and clearly a sign that if nothing happens, they will seek to take action, either if they're trying to deal with the governance of a Swiss private law body, with the Swiss courts, but I think much more likely with the Court of Arbitration for Sport, which is this odd hybrid body that oversees these disputes in all the various Olympic sports and the federations, but won't step in if you haven't actually made some effort to resolve or deal with the dispute before bothering them. But I think the tone of this letter and the way it's written, it's clear that they don't actually expect something to be done, but this is them saying, we tried, we asked you nicely.
It's on the record.
Before they actually do anything more.
Right. So that's the end of the document. Do you have any additional thoughts on this matter in general?
I think that it's a sign of a lot of the problems that have been going on for a few years, and it was, I think, relatively recently that Otto Drakenberg and the Swedish Fencing Federation were very upset about events happening in Saudi Arabia because of women's rights and LGBT rights there, and had a big fight with the FIE, and the FIE's response was, well, we're doing nothing, and we've heard your complaints, and we're still doing nothing. And I think that these issues of governance have been bubbling up for a long time. Even before the sanctions, there was a lot of concerns about the role of money in elections in the FIE, And I think the fact that the Swedish Fencing Federation is clearly willing to make a fight out of this and is willing to make a stand is going to be very interesting. I think the next question is, what other federations get involved? And with no offense to Swedish fencers, some of whom I know, Sweden is not a fencing superpower. Sweden is not putting their neck on the line. And I think the interesting question is, do the bigger federations, the more important federations, decide that this is a chance to clean up the FIE, or do they like the FIE the way it is?
It's a really good point. And one of the things that I have been thinking about a lot since I first read this letter a few days ago is, why do we need to risk all of these bad things potentially happening, including potentially like the dissolution of the FIE in general, in order to have Usmanov back? Like, what does he bring to the table that's so overwhelmingly positive that we're willing to risk all of that? Because he's sanctioned, you can't even say his checkbook, because that's not available to us at this point. So I really don't see the reason that it's so important to have him helm the ship here.
I think, and this is complete speculation, but an element of it is just an institutional conservatism that goes, if we start excluding one guy because he's objectionable, what if they don't stop with the president? What if they start looking at the executive committee and the various secretariats, and they actually start going, well, what if other people might be objectionable? And I think there's a fear that if they allow one person to be removed because he is egregiously bad, other people who are merely very bad may be next in line, and then people who are merely just not great, and on and on and on. And so I think there's a worry that it sets a precedent that could lead to people who have jobs losing them.
Interesting. Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time. That helped me clarify a lot of things. Hopefully people watching have a clear understanding of what happened in that letter, and it'll be very interesting to see what happens next, because the deadline is very soon on that letter.
Yes, and I think as we record this, it's very clear that the most important election in November is, of course, going to be on the 30th, when this will all be decided by the Electoral College of the FIE.
Yeah, great. Looking forward to that. Thank you, Elijah.
Thank you.
All right, cool. That was good.